Good afternoon, good morning. It's probably morning and lunch somewhere. It's now Friday, the 13th of December, and welcome to today's Lunch and Learn, sponsored by KMC Controls and the consulting division of KMC Controls. The title for today is Monitoring and Hardening Government Facilities to Decrease Operational Technology Vulnerabilities and Potential Impact on Building Systems, Personnel, and the environment. And our intent here is to provide you an opportunity to visit with the panelists in a fairly relaxed way, back and forth questions and dialogues, not only between the panelists, which we'll introduce in just a moment, but as well between you. So as you have questions, please post them anytime. We'll do our very best to monitor any of your questions during the session. And as we can, we'll get to them. And as well, about a week from now, there'll be some post-production and a video recording of this will be cleaned up and released to all the people who registered. And let's start with our panelists. So my name is Ari Rubin. I lead KMC Consulting, and joined also by Tim Vogel, who's the Vice President of Connected Solutions. And in just a moment, we'll go around and let everybody introduce themselves. And then Daryl Hagley, who's the Technical Director, posted at the Pentagon. And then we're supposed to have Lynn Baez, and she is not feeling well today. So we're going to miss her. We're going to continue to be inspired by and respect her. But next on the list is Scott. Scott Lanigan is an Executive Vice President at Intelligent Buildings. So, Daryl, I'd like to start with you. Could you briefly just say hello a little bit about, first of all, who you are, what you do, and just a general opinion about kind of what does it mean to harden a government facility? Just general thinking.
Well, thanks, Ari, and I really appreciate everyone dialing in. And so I've been working in OT, cyber policy, processes, and technology for the government for about 14 years. And in my current role, it's the first executive position, technical director for the Air Force and Space Force, focused on OT cyber resilience. And we go out to all the bases and we kind of verify what the status is of OT cyber on our water, power, fuel systems, lighting, fire life safety, camera system security, all those. So I need to preface that all my comments are my own and are not necessarily representative of the Department of Defense or the Air Force. So Ari, you've asked me, how we're doing. We've got a long way to go because these systems were built a long time ago without security in mind, and in some places, when we build new, we're able to add cyber in, but majority of the systems out there are not actively monitored, just like our IT systems are.
I appreciate that. And I want to come back to you because I do want a definition from you of what is and what is not hardening a building. And but I'll give you a moment to noodle on that. Okay. I want to turn next to Scott. Scott, please introduce yourself and tell us as you introduce yourself a little bit of, why this? Why is this your calling? And just a little bit of some of the trends you're seeing right now with hardening of buildings.
Sure. So I'm Scott Lanigan. I'm the Vice President of Operations for Intelligent Buildings. I actually come at it from the other side of the fence. So we focus on kind of putting the OT technology into the building, and in that that has precipitated the need and the understanding around operational technology hardening, especially for our government clients, right? So I think that it is something that we've seen required, at least in my experience with my government clients, that this is something that's non-negotiable for them. I think that that is what is causing us to have that top of mind. And in fact, we see it also in the private sector market that we're dealing with too.
It's very interesting. Tim, please introduce yourself, a little bit of your journey to where you are, and just kind of your opinion of what is and what is not hardening a building.
Sure. So, hi, everyone. It's great to be with you all again. My name is Tim Vogel, VP of Connected Solutions here at KMC Controls. My primary responsibility is our cloud-based software called KMC Commander for visualizing and monitoring your building automation systems in a very secure way. And then we are also working with a team here at KMC and our partner Veridify to launch a cybersecurity solution to help secure and encrypt these OT networks so that we can harden them. How I got here, very briefly, is first joined KMC in 2016 as a marketing manager, helped figure out how to tell the story and create the narrative around how these solutions operate within facilities of all different kinds, and specifically how KMC technology can be applied to that, and then have made my way over into a sales product management role around these other products, which has been a great fit. I also have had the pleasure of leading a podcast that we call the Building Geniuses podcast. And the only reason I bring it up right now is because our latest season was specifically all around, all 13 episodes around cybersecurity and cyber resiliency for government, institutional, and commercial buildings. And so that may be referenced a couple of times, and I encourage everyone to go and take a look at that. So what does hardening mean? I think what it really means, and I'm going to defer to Daryl. I think he's going to have some amazing insight here. But from my standpoint, it is how are we ensuring that only the right people are getting access to what they need to get access to, that we know how it's being connected and what's communicating to it, and that we have ultimately knowledge of what's in the building in the first place. So if you have those three things, I think you're well on your way down that hardening path.
Daryl,
Yeah.
true or false?
Yeah, so Tim, thanks for teeing that up. So well, I think what we've seen is people kind of fall into being able to enable those three is kind of via two methods. One, completely disconnect the system. And if you need to do an update or something like that, you need to take a laptop out there, or the vendor comes directly, shows up in person, and does whatever they need to do. The second camp is, yep, no, we need to be able to monitor it, and we need to have a secure way of doing that, and understanding that person is the only person, and that communication is the only communication allowed. So it's kind of really interesting is, folks have been kind of into these two camps of, we can harden it, and we can harden it without exposing ourselves to further connection, or that's what we need. We need that greater insight to know even if an adversary is trying to get on there. So it is absolutely doable. And I think the tenets of zero trust can help us there. In fact, we're getting feedback from our intelligence collection that if we apply those tenets of zero trust, then and enabling that hardening, it's working, right? So people saying it's just a fad, don't need to do it. I would really counter that. That is enabling hardening that is working and making it difficult for the adversaries to get a foothold on our networks.
Daryl, I want to hit on something you just said, because we do run into what you're referring to as air gapped, right? People want to air gap the building,
you took
completely
the
take
words
it
right
off.
out of my mouth.
Yeah,
that was what I was going to go
hide it from, basically take it off any type of external connection. The problem with that is when you do that, as you said, now you're not monitoring it. You're not keeping an eye on that building. So sure, somebody comes in and plugs a laptop in. Now they may have brought in a polluted laptop, right? And they may have loaded a virus on when they did that. And you may have somebody that says, well, I'm just going to connect it to a cable modem here for a little bit because it makes my job easier. But you don't know that because you're not monitoring the building. And we've seen that multiple times. People do what's expedient and don't understand the ramifications. And there are a lot of people that that live inside of buildings and do things with them. So air gap is kind of a fallacy as far as a safety measure, in my opinion.
Well, let's dig a little deeper into that. So, you and I have had these discussions before. So, what is air gapping between IT and OT systems? A little bit more deep. And secondly, is there a government organization that you're aware of? You don't need to name them, but whatever alphabet soup it is, but if you want to, please feel comfortable, that in your opinion is kind of setting the tone or establishing a benchmark for how they're doing air gapping.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm gonna do like Daryl. Any agency I mention, I am not representing, nor am I in any way a spokesperson for them. So I'm giving my opinion on just my experience.
Of course.
Really, when you talk about IT or OT, I don't consider those being air gapped. I consider those being siloed or physically separate. When you say air gapped, I am thinking of a network that is completely cut off from anything else outside of that building or from itself. So it is just a standalone network that has no other connection. When you see siloed ITOT, which is actually not as common as you'd think, in my opinion, unless you have a really old network, right? That sometimes happens. But a lot of times what we're seeing is an ITOT network converged, because a lot of times you follow much better IT standards doing that, but then they are VLANed logically apart so that they can't crosstalk to each other. Again, you could argue that completely separate networks being managed and monitored with full IT controls and monitoring is the best way to go. But it starts to become cost prohibitive, it becomes difficult to manage, and those kind of things. So a lot of times we see kind of a logical separation using VLANs and whatnot.
Interesting. Tim, I wouldn't mind shifting a little bit from just necessarily one building to maybe more of what we call critical infrastructure. So if you wrap your mind around that a little bit, maybe tell us a little bit, about resiliency or national resiliency of critical infrastructure. First of all, what is it? And what's your opinion about how that should be prioritized to increase operational resilience?
So critical infrastructure is defined from a governmental standpoint. And of course, at this moment, I am forgetting, I don't know if it was a NIST definition. Our friends over at buildingcybersecurity.org or BCS would be excellent spokespeople for this as well. But it ultimately comes down to what is important for our society to continue to function. Some of that would be utilities, whether it be power or water. Some of that would also be commercial buildings themselves, hospitals, schools, offices, the things that allow for production of goods and services to be delivered. But then, also it is things like supply chain, resources, ports, and obviously I would say, and maybe not so obviously, sorry, is, our military operations, government operations, and resiliency in that standpoint as well. So all of those play a factor. We got a window into that during COVID around supply chain. But what I didn't hear a lot of things happening would be like, water or electricity that wasn't working. Or even, from a national defense standpoint. So when I think of national resiliency is how are all of those groups, people, individuals, verticals, making sure that they're putting their, hat in the ring in terms of making sure that they are operating in a resilient way, hardening as much as is reasonable for each of those different groups.
Interesting. So Daryl, based on what Tim said and what you do you think that there's something that water utilities or electric utilities or gas utilities or dams, ports, all these others, do you think they could learn something from what you're doing in your role for the Air Force in terms of improving the resiliency?
So just to circle back on the definition that came from the Department of Homeland Security and we're all going by that.
Mm.
And there's what I've seen is kind of two views of that. There's the critical infrastructure outside of your campus or base or installation that you depend upon. I think Tim was really focusing on. And then there's the stuff that is inside, right? So Ari, as you're talking about, the other infrastructure sectors or other entities, they have their own little infrastructure as well. So sometimes that's confused to say you only have to worry about critical infrastructure, and then people think it's only the power and water outside the base. There are a lot of things inside the base, and so we have developed over the years all this policy and guidance on how to secure it, harden it, and that sort of thing. Is one sector doing better than another? That's hard to tell because a lot of these sectors still don't have sensors in place and are not getting any kind of active monitoring. The EPA put out cyber guidance that said, this is recommended, right? And then, but with on bases, so let's say installations, or let's say there's a Department of Energy entity compound or those sort of things, they have their own infrastructure and they're supposed to be kind of managing that as well and being resilient. And I've heard resilience talked about a number of times. And one of the things that we're finding is once you put a backup generator or or uninterrupted power supply behind it, there's this feeling by some of the infrastructure folks that, whew, okay, got that covered. It's not that critical anymore. And that's not the case. It's still critical, still needs to be secured, and needs to have that extra hardening, not just because you have some fail safes, right? The other one I just wanted to quickly mention is a lot of folks also say, well, we could just run and put stuff in manual mode, right? So just disconnect everything, and the way we harden stuff is you just run it in manual mode and just disconnect it.
It's interesting. It seems like we're in this era of, in this phase of our national journey to start shrinking the size of government. But when you speak like this, Daryl, it begs the question for me: how do you get the right balance? Because years ago, you remember in 2018, I think November 2018, there was an agency created called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA. And they have, and I think it reports into DHS, into Homeland.
Yes.
But they have their own reports, their own standards, their own frameworks, and all these things. And it would seem like if there ever was a role for government to say, okay, this is how you do it, this is how you harden your facility, it seems like people would listen to CISA. I'm just curious, Scott and Daryl, you probably have the most interaction with this.
So I haven't worked directly with CISA. I've talked to folks who have talked about CISA, and one of the thing, again, CISA is an amazing organization for giving guidance. They do a good job of giving guidance, but taking that and actually implementing that is a significant struggle, I would say, for when you get into the larger infrastructure. One of the other things I would say is, when you talk about critical infrastructure, we looked deeply into trying to support with some services we have around zero trust, water systems and whatnot. And the challenge you run into there is that a lot of them are quasi-government, right? And they're a bunch of different organizations, and who do they answer to, and who's got the law to oversee them. And so unless the federal government mandates that thou shalt do this by this date, they've got enough other problems that they're dealing with. It's not a priority until it is a priority type of thing. Even though we have seen attacks against those infrastructures, as well as the Volt Typhoon hiding in schools, to attack other state infrastructure. So it's a definite problem, and we're behind, I would say, grossly from there are pockets where people are doing an amazing job, and I've worked with some of those organizations way ahead of others, but it's scary when you start to look at some of the rest of the infrastructure that is just not protected yet.
It almost like go ahead, please.
Yeah, so Scott brings up some great points there, and I echo the CISA organization has done an amazing job of reaching out to industry and government and getting us all together to agree on what the criteria should be. And they've even have some performance measures that we could use. But what needs to happen is accountability, right? So somebody has to report how well you're doing. I know that the Department of Defense is kind of it's not really a critical infrastructure sector per se. So there's no reporting on how well they're responding to the vulnerabilities that are being posted, right? So where is that national scorecard that comes up and says, here each of those 16 infrastructure sectors, how well are you doing there? So I think that there needs to be some kind of accountability, and we all need to agree that that's worthwhile, and we trust the system per se. I think that will have the potential benefit of getting the visibility needed.
I'm thinking about the property owners and also those leasing. Like in the case of the government, of course, the landlord is the GSA, and it must have somewhere in the range of 8,500 to 9,000 buildings all over the planet. Some of those, just simple office leases, like for the IRS, and some of those quite iconic, like like the White House. But so I think about from their perspective, and I'm kind of wondering, Tim, kind of what are the best practices? What have you seen? You're involved with all these connected systems for buildings. I'm kind of wondering, you have this thermostat, and you have this air quality sensor, and this airflow meter, and this occupancy sensor, and this dot, and you connect them all together. But how do you do it in a way that Daryl and Scott are saying, within some framework, within some standard, saying do it this way to lower your vulnerability, but also you can't break the bank because you have to have some kind of way of either passing on the costs or absorbing them in a way that is feasible. So how do you balance all that? Like, what have you seen as best practices?
Well, I think you could probably put together about 13 episodes in a podcast to talk about all of that. And I know I said I was going to talk about it, so this is a perfect time. We partnered with Building Cybersecurity. Again, I'm going to plug them because one of the things we did is they have a 16-question questionnaire that walks you through, are you ready to start going down this road? And we did an entire episode of walking through that questionnaire. But a lot of it comes down to an assessment. What's in the building, how's it connected, and who has access to it, knowing that foundationally. What systems do you believe to be already air gapped, and what aren't? So you need to understand even like the networking itself and the structure of that. But then it comes down to making sure you're partnering with the right people. I know that IB, Intelligent Buildings, has done a ton of work around doing these assessments and understanding what the risks are, identifying those, but then not just saying, all right, let's go and do everything to your building, but finding the right next steps for each individual client, because the risks are different, the vulnerabilities are different. And then as soon as you layer in a whole 20, 30, 40 years of legacy systems, every building is now a fingerprint, and you can't just apply a broad brush to an entire portfolio, even if they're all owned by the same people, for instance. So it really comes down to that, but we talk a lot more in depth about what those steps are, and obviously would encourage everyone to go and take a look at that content.
Maybe why I asked the next question to Scott. Maybe you could post the link to that, because I think it's very relevant to this conversation here today.
Sure.
So Scott, I was thinking about. Go ahead.
Really good. What Tim said is absolutely spot on. We need to assess where we're at, and 100% of the time, not 90% of the time, 100% of the time, the as-is documentation is wrong. Right. So that's why you have to do these assessments. You have to keep on top of that to make sure you're knowing what is the latest and what's connected. And you have to, as much as we want to just use the logic diagrams and say, okay, just go ahead and make this change, you have to have people walk around and look, because things have been installed, things have been put in place, doors have been left ajar. Right. So unfortunately, and fortunately, you need to have somebody come and do this in person.
We hear horror stories about critical systems in a building, literally where the door is ajar, or where the laptop is on a milk crate and it's on a permanent log in, like it's open, like just doors open, computer's open, enjoy, check out the lighting, check out the fire suppressant. So Scott, I was thinking a little bit about what Tim was saying, and I'm wondering, do tenants, whether they're government or institutional or even commercial, do tenants make the connection that what all these things that you and Tim and Daryl are speaking about, do they make the connection between the core functions and they're trying to do in the building? Like they're trying to be an attorney, or they're trying to be the GSA administrator, or they're trying to do whatever they're trying to do. But if the HVAC is switched too high or switched off, they can't do that. They have to leave the building. And of course, that kind of boomerangs right into the return to work edicts that are hitting pretty hard right now. I'm just curious, do people make the connection between like everything you're doing to keep their buildings up and operational and resilient is core to their getting their work done?
I think when you look at the leaders that are signing the leases and concerned about their business continuity, yes, they get it. And especially if you ever have a hiccup, and it could be non-cyber tech, it could just be the BMS server failed, right? And all of a sudden things fell back into unoccupied mode, and all your spaces are hot, and all of these kind of things. So I do think that they get it. I wouldn't say that I think that it's the first thing that they're thinking about on a daily basis, but I think if you present it to them, they do understand the importance of their buildings being cyber secure, because again, whether you're in banking or your government, you close down that building for a day or two, you've lost productivity, and in a bank situation, probably millions of dollars, right? So it becomes a much bigger issue depending on the organization. And, again, I think they're getting there. But a lot of folks, I mean, let's be honest, if you're not working in our space, a lot of people don't really understand how
Right.
HVACs and everything else in the buildings work. So there's an education piece that has to go into that, and that's incumbent upon all of us in the industry to help them understand why should you care, especially with things like, again, that scares me to death now that elevators are starting to get connected. Elevators for a long time have had their own, special control system that was air gapped to anything else, and now they're starting to be connected. And somebody hacks an elevator, you've got real life safety issues, or they get into your fire suppression.
You see that situation a couple of summers ago, right? In Vegas at the two casinos, where they not only hacked the elevators, but the escalators and the room entry. And I think they even got into the IT for room reservations. And they held him for ransom. I think that was a good wake-up call.
And that's one story that will get some folks' attention when they don't care about building cybersecurity. You tell them if you have bad hygiene, there's probably a high likelihood that you have a crossover into your IT systems,
right?
And it only takes one hole, and now you're exposed. So if you haven't made sure that you're safe over here, you're going to end up with a problem on your IT system too.
And I think there's a great opportunity to help increase that awareness. Right now, I think everybody I know in the department and the government, we have to take an annual computer-based training course for cybersecurity, for information assurance, right? And it goes through all these different scenarios about, you can't have a CD laying around and you can't plug that in, and you can't, do this, and you're supposed to lock things up. And I would love to see an OT part in that scenario, right? So, I mean, it's a half-hour computer-based training and no OT in it at all. So the sooner we can get that in there, so that becomes part of what everyone's familiarity with cyber, then that'll help the awareness.
You see my hand up, Daryl?
I do.
I want to do this with you.
Okay.
Do you want to start this afternoon?
Sure, let's do it.
I think that people on this call, I think other people that we know, men, women, could be incredible at creating a module or a curriculum of modules to do that at different levels. At your level, which is the expert level, I think you need to be refreshed in a certain way. You don't want to waste your time on
Right.
some of the basics. But when you're onboarding someone fresh from college, it's a whole different matter.
Right, and then just the annual review. Like
Sure.
I just got the pop-up says, hey, in 30 days, your annual certificate's going to expire, so you want to take it now,
Right.
right? So again, I could take it, but again, there's no OT in there. There's a question in chat about, how do we stratify, hardening comes down to people, training and processes and things like that. One of the things I think that industry is doing very well, and as Tim and Scott have seen, the chief information security officers, the CIOs, are starting to embrace that they own the OT networks, that they're following up a little bit more closely. Within the government, that a lot of that is still completely separate. Right? So the Air Force CIO does not get a report on how the Air Force OT is doing. Right? So that hasn't happened yet. But so I'm trying to make that happen. But because everything has been run by the infrastructure people and everything's been working and nothing has been disrupted, everyone knows, okay, you guys keep doing what you're doing. Oh, you're still using Windows XP and Windows 7, and you can't fill out this form that says, when will you be ready to adopt everything over to Windows 11? Oh, you're OT, so you're exempt, right? So we really have to start getting past that and come up with other measures of scoring how well we're doing it. And maybe some of the stuff is absolutely just disconnected, standalone, and you just hope, someone who still knows how to run Windows XP to fix it when it breaks.
Interesting.
Yeah. So a couple of things, Daryl, because I want to jump on some of the points that you made. So first of all, to throw the alphabet soup out there for you, for those folks that were at Realcomm this last time, there was a panel by the GSA, their smart buildings infrastructure team, as well as they had their public building IT services person, Sandy Shetshire, on there. And they are tied at the hip. So the things that you're talking about, in fact, if you want to, if folks are looking for a good example, their IT group jumped into understanding that they owned the OT about 15 years ago. It was a little bit of a shock for them that they had these networks in the buildings that by FSMA they had to monitor and manage. And they said, well, let's get after it. And they have done just an amazing job of working together. They do patches, they do updates, they replace end of life equipment. They work together to make sure that those things are done. They scan all the devices going into the buildings and regularly scan, not just when you first get it approved. They go back and scan it every couple of years versus the new threats that are out there. It is really a robust system. I can't, it's probably, in my opinion, of all of the systems I've seen out there, is one of the best. What I will say is that when we talk about, then kind of back to that question of how do you allocate time and money, my experience in dealing with large portfolios is you start where you can, stop the bleeding where you can. So if you get policies out so that if you're doing new modernizations or anything else, that you're following the new you're following the appropriate standards so that you're not perpetuating the issues, right? And then work from there. And then once you've got that going well, then you go in and start to address your legacy issues, right? But I agree with you on the awareness and training. There isn't enough of that, and that's something I've actually talked to several people about on top of that. So
we can partner on that, Scott. We can do that.
There's actually, and one last thing, and I know everybody's heard it, but hardening, everybody's going to zero trust. You need to look for a zero trust solution, or expect, if you're going into a government hardened system, you are going to be dealing with zero trust. And the requirements that go along with that as a vendor are, them keeping an eye on who's logging in, when they're logging in, all of those kind of things, which is great. It's what we want them to do, but it does create a little bit more of an exercise and hurdle for those of us looking to service the government.
Scott or Daryl, could you define zero trust for the audience?
Go ahead, Daryl.
Yeah, so essentially, zero trust is kind of the shift in that instead of having a perimeter fence and then just the one entryway and any comes in now has access inside your campus, inside your house, if you will. Now you need permission and a key to get inside every room within your house, right? And so, your kids have limited access to where they can go, right? So at every point you're checked. You're assuming that the adversary is already in that network. So that is a huge shift in especially in engineering and designing these things. But we're assuming somebody nefarious is in this trusted network. So that's kind of a key point there. I just want to go back just a second. GSA, right. I remember when I visited them a couple of years ago, they had their infrastructure lead and their IT lead sit like two offices next to each other. So that was great. I do, and what they are focused on for those systems are the main systems, I think, in the National Capital Region or another close area. It's not all 9,000 buildings, because those they let up to the customer kind of decide. Again, great program, and I agree it is worth emulating.
Yeah, I think they're focused a lot on their own facilities. They haven't covered all of them yet. They're working on it. They don't get into the leased facilities that much, because it's, again, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time? It kind of Tim, real quick, back to your point. I mean, again, when I think of zero trust, it's I trust no one. You have to prove to me first that I can trust you to come in to access what you want. And, it's really policy driven. You have to have a range trust with each end, with encryption and controls in between, right? So that you don't get a man in the middle type of situation. You don't get the traffic. But if you read anything on government, it's always zero trust. That's where they're going.
Right. And what has made this even a more challenge is, but what we've learned from Volt Typhoon, they replicate a trusted person. So not only do we have to figure out, a mechanism that trust, we have to be able to validate that person is the right person, is logging in at the right time that they typically do, and things like that. So the requirement to secure these from a cyber perspective is just at a whole new level, especially in the OT arena.
I want to shift real quick.
One last point, because this is one of the ways we implement it, is it's not just trusted person, but trusted device. And that usually requires, and so you have to have both, kind of that two-factor authentication type of piece.
Trusted person, trusted behaviors, trusted devices.
Trusted
time of day. Like what are you doing here at 3 a.m. on a Sunday? But let me shift, because this is intriguing to me. And then after we do this little vignette, I want to have each of you do some closing, like, okay, what are some practical 1, 2, 3 next steps? But I heard about this bug bounty, Daryl, and in the context of Hack the Pentagon. I think the Pentagon's is massive, 6+ million square foot structure with millions of miles of corridors and acres of land. Like, how do you is there a thing called Hack the Pentagon? And then what is bug bounty?
So this was an event that was sponsored several years ago. We were not exactly sure what our exposure level was. So we had, crowdsourced, cyber, expertise to come in and say, and we really gave them the IP ranges of our public facing websites of all the different entities that work in the Pentagon and that sort of thing. And so we essentially just gave them a time period, and they just went at it. And then they told us, of course, and then we made it competitive, and we gave money to the people who, told us the most and that sort of thing. And that worked very well. In fact, it worked a little too well, because they ended up finding things that were outside the scope of what we asked for, right? So, and then, we've done those sort of things from a public perspective, but then within the Department of Defense and with other government agencies, they have their own red teams, if you will, to where they will do penetration testing. They'll do testing of different networks. There are much fewer OT experts in the government space. So I know that we've partnered with DHS and some other entities that might have some and commercial folks to do that. There have been some other efforts, hack the railroad, hack the hospital, hack the we're looking to sponsor maybe a hack the airport event. So we learn a lot from that, and then we hopefully change our processes and procedures and bolster our defenses after we learn from those.
Interesting. So before we get into these final statements, Tim or Scott, any thoughts on this kind of stress testing?
I think more of it's needed, and I think I'm former Army officer. One of the best things that we do is critically look at ourselves, right? And I think the military does a really good job of that. I don't know that that's something that is as pervasive as it needs to be to support cybersecurity across the board, government, civilian, all these, because what we find, even when we've done some of these assessments, is people don't like to hear their baby is ugly. And what they need to understand is that we're telling you this to make you better. We're not trying to hound anybody. And so I think it's really critical that we understand we don't expect you to be good in these areas. You're learning and we're getting started, but if you can't take criticism, then we're all in trouble long term.
Tim, I'm going to go to you.
And I'll also make my closing statement, Ari.
Because I want to know, what are the top 3 actions you would recommend decision makers do as a result of this webinar?
Yeah, absolutely. So number 1 is educate yourself. Go out, find the resources, and just start somewhere. Just get to know the terminology and get to know what the real threat landscape is. And then 2, you're not going to be able to do this by yourself. Go find a partner that could help you. And I don't mean go find someone who's going to install something. I mean, go find someone who's going to walk you through that process. It's a consultative process. Scott at IB would be an excellent resource. Fred Gordy at Michael Baker, excellent resource. BuildingCybersecurity.org, excellent resource. Michael McMahon over at Newcomb and Boyd, excellent resources. Like, go talk to these people, vet the partner you want to find, and then partner. And then that third step, I'd say, is going to be, if you've ever heard me talk, it's plan big, start small, and scale fast. Make your plan, but then just start somewhere. Pick a site, pick a location, pick a floor, a zone, a system, whatever it is. Just start small and start working the problem, and you'll see what needs to take place, and then you'll be able to scale.
Thank you, Tim. Daryl, could you give us your top 3?
Certainly. So the one thing that I think that we all need to do is we need to be able to tell a good story to leadership based on, hey, the mission our business is dependent upon this OT, and it needs to be protected. And we've seen a lot of things happen in the news, and try and get information to help tell your story as to why you need to do more than nothing or change what you're doing now in this area. And the second part is to start doing something, is to test your resilience, rehearse, like not having power, water, rehearse things failing, and then developing these little checklists and plans, because when it happens, because it will happen, whether it's man-made or nature, these things are potentially going to fail, and you're going to need to do that. Or thirdly is document all that, create policies to kind of shift and ask for money. Do not refrain from saying, hey, we need more than $0 here. I work with folks in this area all the time. They're just so used to not having money, they're stopping to ask for money. So I think a third part is you've got to ask and say, we need to protect this based on the story I've told you, based on the rehearsal results, and this is what we'll need.
We've got to invest in hardening. So Scott, why don't you close us out? What are your top 3?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of attack this from just a little bit different, because I think Tim and Daryl did a fantastic job talking about it from a portfolio or an owner standpoint. I want to talk to it a little bit from if you're trying to work with a portfolio. So what I would say is understand their policies and have your own policies. you need to lean into this. And I think that you're going to find more often and not, when the decision comes to find a service provider, it's going to be the ones that have already done the thought process of how do they fit into the security of the 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 portfolio. I think one of the critical things is, we're seeing devices. I know that KMC has been pushing this. We're seeing devices that are being built with cybersecurity tied into the mindset. And I think that when you have those type of devices, that's going to put you forward, because that's going to be a request in the RFP. So I think that, knowing what their policies are, having your own policies, and leaning forward as an organization on this, whether you're a builder or you're a service provider or a vendor of a device or software. And then finally, taking your own steps to provide hardening and ensuring that you're ready to go from their standpoint.
I've learned a lot from each of you, and I hope the audience members have as well. There's going to be an opportunity in about a week for this recording to go out to all the registrants and then be posted to YouTube, and so you'll be famous forever on this topic. Thank you very much, each of you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Scott. Lynn, I wish you a speedy and full recovery. And to everyone in the audience, thank you for your time, and I wish you a safe and healthy and enjoyable holiday season.
Thanks, Ari. Appreciate it.
Bye for now.
Thanks, Ari. Thanks, Al.